Did you hear about that event that happened in Jerusalem? The enemies were convinced they would win this war. Israel was weak, with little military strength, so the enemies took advantage of this and decided to attack. But something astonishing happened. The people of Jerusalem cried out to God, and the Heavenly Father immediately sent help from heaven. God sent a single angel, yes, just one angel, because he was more than enough. When this angel arrived in Jerusalem, he went straight for the enemies and, without hesitation, attacked their army, completely destabilizing them, killing over 185,000 enemy soldiers in a single night. I'm going to share more details of this story and how it all unfolded. Don't go anywhere, okay? We're talking about one of the most extraordinary events in history, the night when a single angel of God wiped out 185,000 enemy soldiers of Israel in just one dawn. Can you imagine that? An entire army, considered the most powerful in the world, reduced to absolute silence before the sun rose. This episode isn't just a tale to scare children or poetically strengthen faith. It happened for real, at a specific time and place. The year 701 BC, during the days of King Hezekiah of Judah, when Jerusalem was surrounded by the most cruel and feared empire of the time, Assyria. Think about it, my friend. How could a small kingdom with no significant military forces resist an empire that devastated entire nations in a matter of weeks? Humanly, it was impossible. But that's where divine intervention comes into play so clearly and powerfully that it still leaves scholars, archaeologists, and historians baffled. Because the records aren't just in the Bible, but also in Assyrian inscriptions, and even in accounts from neighboring peoples who witnessed something beyond human logic. Now, I want you to picture the scene of that night with me. King Sennacherib, full of pride, had sent his generals and 185,000 warriors to surround Jerusalem. These were trained soldiers, men hardened by war, known for their brutality and cruelty. They had devastated cities like Lachish, burned altars and deported entire populations, and now they surrounded the holy city, confident that by the next day they would tear down the walls and destroy everything. The general Rabshakeh himself, standing before the walls, mocked loudly, "Your God won't be able to save you from the hands of the king of Assyria." Can you feel the weight of those words? It was more than a military threat. It was a direct affront to the living God. Hezekiah, the king of Judah, upon receiving Sennacherib's insulting letter, tore his clothes in mourning and rushed to the temple. There, before the altar, he spread out the letter and prayed, "Incline your ears, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes and see. Listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he sent to defy the living God." That's in Isaiah chapter 37, verse 17. And here's something fascinating. While the king prayed in Jerusalem, something was stirring in the heavens. The prophet Isaiah received the divine response and declared, "This is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will return by the way he came, for I will defend this city to save it." Isaiah chapter 37, verses 33 to 35. But now comes the part that will really blow you away. That night, the Assyrian camp was in celebration. The soldiers were drinking, laughing, mocking the God of Israel. They had no idea they were living their final hours. A supernatural silence began to settle over the tents. The war animals grew restless. Guards felt an inexplicable chill down their spines. And then, invisible to human eyes, a single angel descended with a direct order from the Most High to destroy the army that dared to defy the living God. My friend, stop and think about this with me. This episode isn't just a display of power. It shows that when everything seems lost, when the enemies are more numerous, when the siege seems unbreakable, God can act in a single night and completely change the story. What was certain disaster turned into victory. What seemed like the end of Jerusalem became one of the greatest proofs of the Lord's mighty arm. And what's even more incredible, this wasn't the first time God defended his people supernaturally, nor was it the last. It's as if he wanted to leave it recorded forever. "I am the Lord of hosts, and no one can defy my name." Do you realize how extraordinary that is? Now let's dive deeper into what happened that dawn, how the watchmen of Jerusalem witnessed the most unbelievable scene in military history, and how even the Assyrian records confirm that something inexplicable paralyzed the most powerful empire on earth. Inside the walls of Jerusalem, the night seemed endless. Families were gathered in prayer, mothers held their children close, and Judah's soldiers watched from the towers, not knowing what awaited them at dawn. Imagine the tension, my friend. You're surrounded with little food, no real chance of resistance, and facing you is the greatest army of the ancient world, ready to crush your city. But at the same time, in the temple, Hezekiah was certain of one thing: the Lord would not abandon his people. He had received the word through the prophet Isaiah, and that was enough for him. While the Assyrians laughed outside, inside the city, a small group trusted with unwavering faith in the God of Israel. And then, in that dawn, the impossible happened. The angel of the Lord entered the enemy camp. The Bible says in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 35, "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead bodies." Can you feel the power of that statement? These aren't poetic words. They're exact numbers, a testimony of a supernatural event. Now here's something that will give you chills. There was no battle, no human sword involved. A single heavenly messenger, obeying God's direct command, silently wiped out the world's greatest army. Picture the vision of Jerusalem's watchmen at dawn. They expected to see the enemies preparing to attack, but instead they saw a valley covered with motionless bodies. 185,000 warriors fallen without a single arrow fired against the walls. This isn't a coincidence, my friend. The Bible is very clear about this. It was the mighty arm of the Lord stretched out to defend the city that bore his name. Isaiah chapter 31 verse 5 had already announced, "Like birds hovering, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it, passing over to save and rescue." And what's even more striking, the historical records of Assyria itself confirm that something extraordinary happened. In Sennacherib's inscriptions, he describes all the cities he conquered in Judah. But when it comes to Jerusalem, he doesn't mention victory. He only says, "Hezekiah, king of Judah, I shut up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage." Do you see? He doesn't speak of conquest, doesn't speak of victory, because there simply wasn't one. Now imagine the impact of this. The greatest empire on earth forced to retreat before a single angel, Sennacherib's pride crushed, and Jerusalem saved, not by human strength, but by the direct hand of God. This didn't just strengthen the people's faith. It became an eternal reminder that the Lord fights for those who trust in him. My friends, stop for a moment and reflect. If God was able to defeat the most powerful army on earth with just one angel, do you really think he can't act in your life? If he was able to hear Hezekiah's prayer, do you think he doesn't hear yours? And here I want to ask you something special. If you believe that the same God who sent his angel to defend Jerusalem can still act powerfully in your life today, write in the comments, "I trust in the Lord of hosts." I want to see this declaration of faith spreading, because this is a living testimony of what we believe. The silence of that night gave way to the awe of the morning. The songs of lament were replaced by songs of victory, and the people understood once and for all that true power doesn't lie in human armies, but in the God who reigns over all nations. The dawn of that day was like no other in Jerusalem's history. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the walls, the watchmen in disbelief looked out over the valley. Where the night before there had been a sea of tents, fire, and soldiers in motion, now there was only a deathly silence. The wind stirred the Assyrian banners, but no hands were there to hold them. An entire army had been silenced. Picture the scene with me. The guards called to one another, rubbing their eyes as if they couldn't believe what they saw. Some ran down to King Hezekiah to report the vision. Hezekiah, along with the prophet Isaiah, climbed the wall, looked out to the horizon, and witnessed the miracle with his own eyes. 185,000 men fallen without fighting, without war cries, without resistance. Just the result of the intervention of the Almighty God. The Bible records in 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verse 21, "And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed every mighty man, commander and leader in the camp of the king of Assyria, and he returned in shame to his land." Do you see, my friend? It wasn't Judah's sword nor alliances with other peoples, it was the invisible hand of God. And what's even more extraordinary, even the enemies had to admit it. Ancient historians report that a mysterious plague struck the army. But we know the truth. It wasn't a common disease. It was divine justice responding to the prayer of a king who trusted fully in God. Now think about how this echoed inside the city. The people who the night before were weeping and fearing death, by morning were singing, celebrating, dancing in the streets. Psalms were sung, children ran free, women prayed. The impossible had happened before everyone's eyes. And you know what's even more impactful? This didn't stay hidden. The news spread quickly to neighboring lands. Peoples who once trembled before Assyria now wondered, who is this God who destroys entire armies in a single night? The miracle not only saved Jerusalem, but also showed the whole world that the Lord of hosts is sovereign over all nations. And here I need to tell you something very important. This channel exists to bring you these extraordinary Bible stories with rich detail, with the intensity they deserve. Stories that aren't myths, but records of a God who acts in human history. If you're being impacted by this narrative, I invite you to subscribe now, because every week we bring new content like this, revealing miracles, secrets, and prophecies that will strengthen your faith. And there's more. Those who subscribe and turn on the notification bell receive a special reward. We've prepared a PDF guide with 7 powerful prayers for deliverance, based on biblical passages like this one, so you can declare the same protection that guarded Jerusalem that night in your life. It's our gift to you who choose to dive deeper into the knowledge of the Word. So if this story is touching your heart, don't wait any longer. Subscribe now and receive this gift that will help you pray with authority and confidence, just as Hezekiah prayed. And while the people of Jerusalem celebrated, King Sennacherib, humiliated, prepared to return to his land. But what was about to happen in Nineveh would show that divine justice had not yet finished its work. Sennacherib left Jerusalem a broken man. He who had boasted of being the terror of nations now returned to Nineveh in shame, with an army destroyed in an inexplicable way. Imagine the scene: empty chariots, surviving soldiers walking in silence, unable to look their king in the eye. The conqueror of Mesopotamia now fled from the city he couldn't subdue. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, the atmosphere was one of celebration and reverence. The people filled the temple to give thanks. The Levites sang psalms. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Psalm chapter 27, verse 1. These words took on new weight after the night when God had shown his power so overwhelmingly. But something deeper was happening behind the miracle. The prophet Isaiah seized the moment to teach. Human power is nothing before God. He reminded the people that trusting in political alliances, as many wanted to do with Egypt, was an illusion. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. Isaiah chapter 31, verse 1. Do you see how extraordinary this is? While the greatest empire on earth fell before a single angel, Jerusalem stood firm, not because of its walls or weapons, but because a king dared to bow his knees before the living God. That's the most striking contrast of the story. Sennacherib trusted in human strength, Hezekiah trusted in the power of the Most High. Now here's something that will give you chills from head to toe. The same God who intervened in that dawn is the God who can intervene in your life today. You may be surrounded without a way out, feeling like you can't win. But when you place your trust in the Lord, He sends deliverance, maybe not through a visible angel, but in ways so supernatural that only you and He will know it was His hand. And my friend, before we go on, I want to ask you something very special. If this story is touching your heart and you feel gratitude for this miracle recorded in the Bible, click the like button on this video now. It's not just a button. It's a way to spread this message so more people can be reached and hear this word. Every time you click, YouTube understands that this content has value and shares it with others who need to hear it. And as you do that, come back with me to that scene. The people of Judah celebrated, but they knew the threat still existed. Assyria hadn't disappeared and Sennacherib still reigned, but there was a certainty etched in the heart of every man, woman, and child. The Lord had defended Jerusalem and no one could erase that. The sound of trumpets echoed through the city walls, not as a warning of war, but as an announcement of victory. And amid the songs, Isaiah raised his voice and proclaimed, "The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." It was the divine signature on the miracle. The people understood that they hadn't just survived. They had seen the arm of the eternal God act in their favor. The days following the deliverance were filled with intense activity in Jerusalem. The streets were alive with celebrations, but also with work. The people began burying the bodies of the Assyrians outside the walls, following King Hezekiah's orders. Even though they were enemies, there was a sense of respect for the divine judgment that had fallen upon them. Strong men, accompanied by priests, went out in groups to collect the dead, while inside the city, Families sang songs of gratitude. The miracle of that night changed not only the spiritual atmosphere of the city, but also its political standing in the ancient world. In no time, messengers from neighboring kingdoms began arriving with gifts and offerings, recognizing that the God of Judah had done something impossible. The small kingdom, which had seemed on the brink of destruction, was now seen as protected by heaven. But there's something you need to understand. Even in the midst of triumph, Isaiah warned the people. He reminded them that the victory shouldn't lead to pride, but to humility before God. Thus says the Lord, "The heavens are my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you would build for me, and where is the place of my rest?" Isaiah chapter 66, verse 1. The prophet made it clear. The glory wasn't Judah's, but the Lord's. Hezekiah, moved by this reminder, called the people to a great celebration in the temple. Sacrifices of thanksgiving were offered, and the king, in tears, declared before the assembly, "Today we saw that the Lord is a warrior. He fought for us." Those words echoed in the heart of every person present. But now comes something that will hit you hard. While Jerusalem was filled with joy, in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, a silence of shame reigned. Sennacherib returned with only a fraction of his army. His own records, carved in stone, omitted the defeat. He didn't have the courage to admit what really happened. He only declared that Hezekiah was trapped like a bird in a cage. Do you see? Even in the official Assyrian records, there's silence about the victory that never came. And it's exactly this contrast that shows the truth of the word. When God acts, the enemy can't even explain what happened. Even today, Assyrian scholars try to justify that defeat as a plague, famine, or some other natural explanation. But we know it was the invisible hand of the Most High. My friend, I want you to picture this. The same God who confounded the powerful back then is the same God who still acts today. He's an expert at silencing those who mock him. He's an expert at turning impossible situations around. He's an expert at transforming threats into testimonies. And while the Psalms echoed through the streets of Jerusalem, the priests declared, "Great things the Lord has done for us, and for this we are glad." Psalm chapter 126, verse 3. That joy wasn't ordinary. It was a joy born of the impossible, of supernatural deliverance. But the most extraordinary thing was still to come, because this victory wouldn't be forgotten. It would be recorded forever in the Scriptures, as an eternal testimony that the Lord fights for his people. And this wasn't just for Judah. It was for you, for me, for all who, in any generation, need to remember that God's arm is not shortened. Hezekiah still had many challenges ahead of him. Pride would try to creep in. The enemy would try to return. But at that moment, every stone in Jerusalem bore witness that the Lord of hosts had risen to defend his city. As the days passed, Jerusalem breathed a sigh of relief. The terror of the previous night was already distant, but the memory of what the Lord had done remained alive in every heart. Mothers told their children, priests recounted it in worship, soldiers recalled it on the walls. It was impossible to forget the silence of the enemy camp that morning. However, Isaiah knew that human memory is fragile. So he called the scribes and ordered them to record every detail, every word of Hezekiah's prayer, every insult from Sennacherib, every response from God. Thus was born the testimony you read today in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and the book of Isaiah itself. The prophet wanted to ensure that future generations knew the miracle wasn't a legend, but a real intervention by the living God. And you know what's even more impressive? Even archaeology confirms this account. In Nineveh, scholars found Sennacherib's annals, where he describes his victories against various cities of Judah. But when it comes to Jerusalem, the text changes. It doesn't speak of victory, doesn't speak of conquest. It only says that Hezekiah was locked up like a bird in a cage. Why didn't he report a victory? Because there was no victory. The silence of the Assyrian king is in itself a confession of defeat. Now here's something that will give you chills. Centuries later, Greek historians like Herodotus also mentioned that the Assyrian army was decimated in a mysterious way, even talking about rats that supposedly destroyed weapons and caused a plague. Do you see what this means? Even outside the Bible, there are echoes of this event. The whole world, in some way, learned that something inexplicable had paralyzed the most powerful empire on earth. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King Hezekiah strengthened the people in faith. He ordered psalms to be sung daily in the temple, so no one would forget who had saved the city. And one of the most remembered passages was Psalm chapter 46, verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. That truth had become visible to all. And here, my friend, I want to make a direct invitation. Just as the people of Judah publicly proclaimed their faith, I want you to do the same now. If this story has strengthened your trust in the Lord, write in the comments, "The Lord is my refuge and strength." This phrase is a declaration of faith. It's like raising a flag saying you belong to the God who still works miracles today. And as you declare this, think, the night that seemed to bring destruction to Jerusalem turned into a dawn of victory. What seemed like the end became a new beginning. That's God's pattern. He steps in when man has no way out, to show that the glory belongs only to Him. But something deeper was happening in that generation. The deliverance wasn't just to save a city, it was to preserve a promise. Because from Jerusalem, from the lineage of David, the Messiah would come, and no human army could stop God's eternal plans. Time passed, and the news of the deliverance spread to all the surrounding nations. In every market, tavern, and road, travelers spoke of the night when the God of Israel destroyed 185,000 soldiers without a sword being raised. It was impossible to ignore. Even the most skeptical enemies had to admit that something extraordinary had happened. In Jerusalem, the people's confidence in God reached an extraordinary level. Families spoke of this miracle as if it were a treasure. If the Lord did this for us, they said, then He can protect us from any other threat. King Hezekiah, in his joy, dedicated even more resources to the temple, restoring damaged areas and reinforcing daily worship. But Isaiah the prophet watched everything with spiritual eyes. He knew the human heart is fickle. Today it sings praises, tomorrow it can forget. So he continually warned, "The Lord is exalted, for He dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness, and there will be stability in your times, abundance of salvation, wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is your treasure." Isaiah chapter 33, verses 5 and 6. Now, notice something extraordinary with me. The deliverance of Jerusalem wasn't just for that generation. It had a prophetic purpose. It was necessary for the city to be preserved, for from it would come the promise of the Messiah. If Jerusalem had fallen that day, the lineage of David would have been crushed, and the prophecy of the coming Christ would have been interrupted. Can you imagine that? An angel not only saved a city, but preserved the eternal plan of salvation. Meanwhile, in Nineveh, the defeat left deep scars. Sennacherib tried to maintain his image as a great king, but everyone knew something supernatural had happened in Judah. The silence of the Assyrian scribes was deafening. The king's pride had been wounded in a way that would never heal. Years later, he would meet a tragic end at the hands of his own sons, exactly as Isaiah had prophesied. This shows, my friend, that no one defies the living God and goes unpunished. And here I want to call you to reflect. How many times have you been surrounded, without a way out like Jerusalem? How many times have spiritual enemies, problems, illnesses, debts, or persecutions seemed like an army too big to defeat? Know that the same God who sent an angel that night still has the power to act today. You may not see it, but the heavens move in response to the prayer of a heart that trusts. In that generation, everyone knew the victory wasn't by strength or sword, but by the Spirit of the Lord. Hezekiah recorded it, Isaiah preached it, and even neighboring peoples recognized it. The miracle became an eternal proof that the God of Israel reigns over all the kingdoms of the earth, and it's exactly this memory that leads us to understand that God's power has no limits. A single angel was enough to destroy the greatest army of the time. Imagine, then, what God can do in your life when He Himself stretches out His hand. The weeks following the great deliverance transformed Jerusalem into a center of awe. Neighboring peoples sent gifts, messengers arrived with congratulations, and even distant kingdoms wanted to understand what had happened. It was impossible to hide the mighty hand of God. The small kingdom of Judah, which had seemed on the brink of destruction, was now seen as untouchable, guarded by heaven. But Isaiah, ever vigilant, warned, "It wasn't because of your righteousness that the Lord did this, but for the sake of His name and the promise made to David, His servant." The prophet reminded them that the victory shouldn't turn into pride. It was an opportunity for the people to remain faithful. In every sermon, he emphasized that the God who sent the angel that night was the same God who demanded holiness, purity, and daily trust. Hezekiah, in turn, used the prestige of the miracle to implement even stronger spiritual reforms. The last pagan altars were destroyed, and the people were called to exclusive worship of the Lord. It was as if the victory had reignited a flame of devotion throughout the kingdom. Now, here's something that will give you chills. Amid the celebrations, messengers from Babylon arrived with gifts and letters. They didn't come out of love, but out of curiosity and political interest. They wanted to meet the king who had been saved so miraculously. They wanted to see the temple's treasures and the city's riches, and Hezekiah, flattered, opened his doors and showed everything. The prophet Isaiah sharply rebuked him. "Behold, the days are coming when everything in your house will be carried off to Babylon." Isaiah chapter 39, verse 6. Do you see? Pride is always a trap, even after the greatest victories. But despite Hezekiah's mistake, the memory of the angel never faded. The psalms sung in the temple echoed with power. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Psalm chapter 20, verse 7. That was the mark of that generation. My friend, here I want to ask you something special. If you believe that the same God who defeated 185,000 soldiers is still the same God who guards your life, write in the comments, "I trust in the power of the living God." This phrase is more than words. It's a declaration of faith that affirms before the spiritual world that you belong to the Lord who fights for you. And as the people declared this in their songs and prayers, the message spread everywhere. Even the most distant peoples heard of the night when the God of Israel showed that no human weapon can withstand his outstretched arm. The testimony wasn't just of a local miracle, but of an eternal message. The Lord is the one who defends those who trust in him. Over time, the victory over the Assyrians became a reference point for the entire nation. Whenever someone doubted divine protection, the elders would recount, "Don't you remember what the Lord did in those days?" It wasn't the human arm, but a single angel that silenced the greatest army on earth. That memory passed from father to son, from generation to generation, like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. In the temple, the Levites continually sang psalms of gratitude. One of them, recited with tears in their eyes, said, "If the Lord had not been on our side," let Israel say, "if the Lord had not been on our side when people rose up against us, they would have swallowed us alive." Psalm chapter 124, verses 1 and 2. Those words fit perfectly with what Jerusalem had experienced. But there was also a hidden warning in that memory, because the same God who sends deliverance is the God who demands faithfulness. Isaiah tirelessly repeated that trusting in human alliances, wealth or idols would always be a trap. He said to the people, "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord." Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 5. Though these words would echo in later centuries, the principle was already alive in the prophets' hearts. Victory only comes through faithfulness to God. Now, something fascinating. Neighboring peoples, hearing the story, began to fear Jerusalem not for its walls or soldiers, but because the living God was there. Ambassadors came with gifts, seeking alliances, but in truth, what they feared was facing the same fate as the Assyrians, and so the name of the Lord was magnified among the nations. But you know what's most impactful, my friend? This miracle wasn't just to protect Jerusalem from a threat. It preserved the lineage of David, from which Jesus, the Christ, would come. Do you see? If the city had fallen, the promise of the Messiah would have been interrupted. The angel's action wasn't just military, it was prophetic, ensuring the plan of salvation continued. That gives me chills just thinking about it. Hezekiah, strengthened by all he had seen, continued leading spiritual reforms. He reinforced worship in the temple, maintained the purification from idolatry, and called the people to seek the Lord like never before. But like every generation, they faced the risk of forgetting. That's why Isaiah raised his voice. "The Lord of hosts is wonderful in counsel and great in wisdom." Isaiah chapter 28, verse 29. While the king and people celebrated in Nineveh, the wound remained open. Sennacherib's pride had been shattered. His own sons plotted against him, and the prophecy given by Isaiah was about to be fulfilled. The man who defied the God of Israel would fall by the sword in his own land. Jerusalem, however, stood firm, surrounded by the memory of a night when the impossible happened. The people's faith had been renewed, and with every sunset, families and no one can touch us without his permission. The years went on, But the memory of that dawn remained alive like a sacred scar in Judah's history. At every temple celebration, someone always mentioned, "It was the Lord who delivered us from the Assyrians." It was impossible to forget, because the echo of that miracle still resonated. The people didn't just remember, they lived under the shadow of the victory God had given them. Hezekiah, now older, looked back and recognized that his entire reign had been marked by that deliverance. If it hadn't been for divine intervention, Jerusalem would have been destroyed, the temple burned, the people taken captive. But God had preserved not just a city, but a promise. Hezekiah knew this, and so he sought to keep the people's hearts turned to the Lord. Isaiah, with his prophetic voice, reinforced this vision. He constantly reminded them that the God of Israel wasn't just the God of an isolated miracle, but the Lord of history who rules over kings and nations. In his words was the announcement of something even greater. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. Do you see? The angel who destroyed the Assyrian army was just a shadow of the greater deliverance to come through the promised Messiah. Now here's something that will deeply impact you. Modern archaeologists, excavating the ruins of Nineveh, found records of Sennacherib's campaign. They list the cities he conquered, the tributes received, the walls torn down. But about Jerusalem, only silence and vague words. No account of victory, no description of conquest. It's as if a page had been torn from Assyrian history. That emptiness is, in fact, a powerful testimony. It shows that the defeat was so humiliating it couldn't be recorded. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the victory was celebrated not with silence, but with songs. The people sang, "The Lord frustrates the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. The plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations." Psalm chapter 33, verses 10 and 11. It was as if every word had been written by the deliverance they had experienced. But my friend, there's a personal lesson for us here. How many times do we try to face life's battles with our own strength, forgetting that it's the Lord who sustains us? Jerusalem wasn't saved by its weapons or walls. It was saved because it bowed its knees in prayer. That changes everything. And you know what's even more incredible? The same God who heard Hezekiah still hears you today. He remains the God who answers in the midst of a siege, the God who sends deliverance when all seems lost. The miracle of the angel isn't just a distant memory. It's an eternal proof that the Lord's arm is not shortened and his ears are not closed. Hezekiah, looking to the future, knew new threats would come, but he also knew there was a faithful God in heaven, and that certainty sustained the people of Judah like an invisible shield, greater than any stone wall. As the years passed, the story of the angel who destroyed 185,000 Assyrians ceased to be just a war story. It became a symbol of faith. Whenever a father told this story to his son, he didn't just speak of numbers or armies, but of the power of a God who defends his own. And every time that memory was retold, the people's faith was renewed. Jerusalem became known as the city where the Most High had shown his mighty arm. Pilgrims came to worship in the temple and wanted to hear the elders recount that dawn. Priests pointed to the walls and said, "Right here, when all seemed lost, the Lord stretched out his hand and delivered us." It was impossible to be in the city and not feel the weight of that divine intervention. Meanwhile, in Nineveh, the silence continued. Sennacherib, defeated and humiliated, tried to hold his crown with an iron fist, but the shadow of what had happened in Jerusalem haunted him. His own sons plotted against him, and Isaiah's prophecy waited for its moment to be fulfilled. The king who had mocked the living God would end his life by the sword in his own temple, killed by those who should have inherited his throne. Do you see how extraordinary this is? The same God who brought down the Assyrian army ensured that the arrogant man who defied his name fell like dust. Now, my friend, stop and reflect. The angel that night didn't just fight for Jerusalem. He fought for something much greater. He preserved the throne of David from which the Messiah would come. Every Assyrian soldier who fell in the silence of that dawn represented a threat nullified against the promise of Christ's coming. The miracle was more than a military victory. It was part of building eternal salvation. And here's something that will give you chills. The same hand that preserved Jerusalem that night is the hand that still sustains your life today. You may feel surrounded, pressured, without a way out as Jerusalem was, but know that there is a God who can send deliverance in a single dawn. He can silence the enemy, turn the situation around, and transform tears into songs of victory. And you know what's most striking? When the peoples heard what had happened, they didn't exalt Jerusalem's walls or Hezekiah's strategies. They recognized that there was a true God in Israel. The miracle pointed to the Lord, not to men. So it is with you. When God acts in your life, it will be so clear, so extraordinary, that no one will be able to give the glory to anyone but Him. And while Jerusalem lived under the shadow of that victory, the prophets continued announcing that the greatest deliverance was yet to come. The angel who killed 185,000 soldiers was just a glimpse of heavenly power. But the Son of God would one day come to defeat not just armies, but the very power of sin and death. The years passed, and the night of the Lord's angel became a memory etched in Israel's soul. But more than a war story, it became an eternal message of trust. The people could look back and say, "The Lord fought for us, and that's why we stand." Hezekiah passed into rest, but his prayer continued to echo in the scriptures. Isaiah grew old, but his prophecy was preserved, recorded so that you today could hear this story and understand that God remains the same. The Assyrian army vanished, Sennacherib's throne fell, but the word of the Lord endures. My friend, I want you to think with me now, if God was able to bring down the greatest empire in the world with just one angel, don't you think He can act in your marriage? Don't you think He can open a door for a job? Don't you think He can heal an illness? Don't you think He can change your entire story in a single night? The same Lord who defended Jerusalem remains our refuge today. The Bible declares in Psalm chapter 91 verse 11, "For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." Do you see? The promise isn't just for Hezekiah or Jerusalem. It's for all who trust in the living God. And here's the most intimate part of this story. The angel who delivered Judah that night preserved a lineage, and from that lineage came Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah. In other words, that deliverance wasn't just military, it was spiritual, preparing the way for eternal salvation. The same God who defeated the Assyrians sent His Son to defeat the greatest enemy of all, sin and death. Now I want to speak directly to you. Maybe you're living your own Assyrian siege. Problems, debts, illnesses, persecutions. Maybe you feel like there's no way out, no strength as Jerusalem felt. But remember, the prayer of a king moved the heavens. Your prayer can too. The God of Hezekiah is your God today. And you know what's most extraordinary? The same Jesus who conquered death promised to be with us always until the end of the age. He's the guarantee that we're not alone. When the enemy rises like an army against us, the Lord sends His help. So close your eyes now and reflect, what are the Assyrians surrounding your life? What seems impossible to you? Surrender it to the Lord in prayer. Say like Hezekiah, "Incline your ears, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes and see." He still hears, He still sees, He still acts. And I end this journey with you by reminding you of an unchanging truth. If God is for us, who can be against us? Romans chapter 8 verse 31. Let this story be more than an ancient tale for you. Let it be an invitation to trust in the living God who sends angels, opens doors, answers prayers, and preserves promises. The God who acted in Jerusalem is the same God who acts in your life today. Believe, trust, and live as one who knows. The Lord of hosts fights for you.